Lieutenant Sarah Martinez had never expected her military career to lead her to this moment. Standing in the briefing room at Forward Operating Base Kilo in Afghanistan, she watched the digital map on the screen showing red zones that meant certain death for anyone foolish enough to venture there. The intelligence officer's voice cut through the tension like a knife. The Taliban has completely surrounded Hill. Force, our reconnaissance shows at least 300. Enemy fighters have taken strategic positions around the entire perimeter. They've been planning this for weeks. The room fell silent except for the hum of the air conditioning unit struggling against the desert heat. Sarah's eyes stayed fixed on the screen where a small blue dot indicated the location of Bravo Company. 480 Marines who had been conducting a routine patrol when the trap was sprung. What should have been a simple reconnaissance mission had turned into a nightmare. The enemy had waited patiently, watching their movements, studying their patterns, and then struck with devastating precision. Colonel Richards stood at the front of the room, his weathered face showing the strain of command. He had been fighting wars for 23 years, but Sarah could see something different in his expression today. Fear. Not for himself, but for the men trapped on that hill. The situation is critical, he continued, pointing to satellite images that showed the Marines' defensive positions growing smaller by the hour. The trapped Marines had managed to establish a small perimeter on the rocky outcrop, but they were running out of everything that mattered. Ammunition was getting scarce. Medical supplies were nearly gone. Water was being rationed to just a few sips per man. And the summer heat in Afghanistan was brutal, reaching temperatures that could kill even without enemy bullets. "We've lost contact with their radio operator," Richards explained. "Last transmission was 6 hours ago. They reported 12 wounded and requested immediate evacuation." The silence that followed felt heavy, pressing down on everyone in the room like a physical weight. Sarah knew what everyone was thinking, but nobody wanted to say. A rescue mission would be suicide. The Taliban controlled every approach to the hill. They had machine gun nests, rocket-propelled grenades, and enough ammunition to hold their positions for days. Any helicopter trying to reach the Marines would be shot down before it got within a mile of the landing zone. "Sir, what about artillery support?" asked Captain Morrison, the battalion's fire support coordinator. His question hung in the air like smoke from a cigarette. "Negative," Richards replied grimly. "The Marines are too close to civilian villages. Rules of engagement prohibit heavy artillery in that sector. We can't risk civilian casualties." The military had learned hard lessons about winning hearts and minds in Afghanistan. Every civilian death created 10 new enemies. Sarah found herself studying the faces around her. These were experienced officers, men and women who had seen combat in Iraq and Afghanistan. They understood the mathematics of war. Sometimes good people died because there were no good options. Sometimes the best decision was the one that saved the most lives, even if it meant sacrificing a few. But Sarah couldn't accept that mathematics, not when she knew some of those Marines personally. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez had helped her fix her Humvee just last week. Private Johnson was only 19 years old and always talked about his girlfriend, back home in Ohio. Corporal Williams had 3 kids and a wife who was pregnant with their 4th child. "There has to be something we can do," she said, surprised to hear her own voice cutting through the heavy silence. Every eye in the room turned to her. She was the most junior officer present, barely 6 months into her deployment. Colonel Richards looked at her with a mixture of sympathy and frustration. "Lieutenant Martinez, I understand how you feel, we all do. But I won't sacrifice more lives on an impossible mission. The terrain around Hill 394 is completely exposed. Any rescue attempt would result in more casualties." Sarah's mind raced through the tactical situation. She had studied the area extensively during her previous missions. There was something the intelligence reports weren't considering, something about the seasonal weather patterns that created opportunities during certain times of day. "Sir, what about the morning fog?" she asked. "During monsoon season, thick fog rolls through those valleys every morning before dawn. It doesn't lift until the sun gets higher, around 800 hours. The intelligence officer checked his computer screen. "She's right about the fog, sir. Satellite imagery shows consistent weather patterns in that region. Visibility drops to less than 50 meters during the early morning hours." Colonel Richards shook his head. "Even with fog cover, it's too dangerous. We don't have precise coordinates for enemy positions. Flying blind in that terrain would be catastrophic." But Sarah was already thinking several steps ahead. She had flown reconnaissance missions over that exact area multiple times. She knew every ridge, every valley, every rock formation. More importantly, she knew the one approach route that might work. It was risky. Incredibly risky, but it was possible. "Sir, I know that terrain better than anyone in this unit," she said. "I've flown over it dozens of times. There's a narrow canyon on the eastern side that the Taliban might not be watching. It's too narrow for large helicopters, but a small bird might be able to make it through." The room erupted in quiet murmurs as officers began discussing the possibility. Sarah could see wheels turning in their minds, calculating odds, weighing risks against potential rewards. Colonel Richards raised his hand for silence. "Even if we could get a helicopter close to the hill, how would we extract 480 Marines? No single aircraft has that capacity." "Multiple trips," Sarah replied immediately. "Start with the wounded, then extract in groups of 15 to 20. Use the fog as cover for as long as possible." The colonel stared at her for a long moment. Sarah could practically see him running through scenarios in his head, considering variables, thinking about all the things that could go wrong. And there were many things that could go wrong. "The answer is no, Lieutenant," he said finally. "I will not authorize a suicide mission. That's final." But as the meeting broke up and officers filed out of the briefing room, Sarah remained behind, staring at the map on the screen. Somewhere out there, 480 Marines were fighting for their lives, waiting for help that might never come. She thought about their families back home, waiting for phone calls that might never happen. That night, Sarah lay in her bunk, staring at the ceiling, unable to sleep. Through the thin walls of the barracks, she could hear other soldiers talking quietly about the trapped Marines. Everyone knew the situation was hopeless, but nobody wanted to say it out loud. In 12 hours, she would make a decision that would change everything. At 0300 hours, Sarah Martinez quietly slipped out of her bunk and made her way through the darkened base. The night air was cool, a welcome relief from the scorching heat that would return with the sunrise. Most of the base was asleep, with only essential personnel manning their posts. Security guards nodded to her as she passed, assuming she was heading to an early morning briefing or duty assignment. But Sarah had something entirely different in mind. She was walking toward the flight line where 3 UH-60 Blackhawks sat silent in the darkness, their rotors motionless against the star-filled sky. These helicopters represented the only hope for the trapped Marines on Hill 394, and Sarah knew that in a few hours, that hope would disappear with the morning fog. Chief Warrant Officer Jake Thompson was performing his pre-dawn maintenance check on the lead helicopter when Sarah approached. Jake was a veteran pilot with 15 years of experience and a reputation for being able to fly anything with rotors through any kind of weather. He looked up from his checklist when he heard footsteps approaching. "Little early for you, isn't it, Lieutenant?" Jake asked, wiping grease from his hands with a dirty rag. "Thought you intelligence types preferred your beauty sleep." Sarah took a deep breath. What she was about to propose would end both their careers if it went wrong. But if they did nothing, 480 Marines would likely die before the day was over. "Jake, I need to ask you something, and I need you to hear me out completely before you answer." Something in her tone made Jake stop what he was doing and give her his full attention. In the dim light from the hangar, Sarah could see the concern in his weathered face. "This is about those Marines on Hill 394, isn't it?" "The fog will roll in at 5:30, Sarah continued. "We have maybe 2 hours of cover before it lifts." "I know the terrain, Jake. I know exactly how to get in there." Jake set down his tools and crossed his arms. "Lieutenant, I heard about the briefing yesterday. Colonel Richards specifically ordered no rescue attempts. What you're talking about is disobeying direct orders." "I know what I'm talking about," Sarah replied firmly. "And I know what happens to soldiers who disobey orders. But I also know what happens to Marines who are left to die when someone could have saved them." For several minutes, Jake said nothing. He walked around the helicopter, checking fuel levels, testing control surfaces, going through his routine as if this was just another normal morning. But Sarah could see him thinking, weighing the consequences of what she was proposing. "How many Marines did you say were trapped up there?" he asked finally. 480, Jake whistled low. "That's a lot of mothers who won't see their sons come home. A lot of kids who won't see their fathers again." He paused, looking up at the helicopter's main rotor. "This bird can carry maybe 20 people max, depending on gear and fuel load. Even if we made multiple trips, it would take hours." "I've calculated the flight times," Sarah said, pulling out a piece of paper covered with her handwriting. With the fog cover, we can make at least 8 trips before visibility clears. That's enough to get all the wounded out and maybe half the remaining troops. And what about the other half? Sarah's voice was steady, but Jake could hear the emotion underneath. Then we keep flying until we get them all, fog or no fog. Jake stared at her for a long moment. In his 15 years of military service, he had seen plenty of officers who were willing to risk other people's lives for their own glory. But he had never seen anyone willing to risk their own career and life to save people they barely knew. "You realize this is completely insane, right?" he said. "Even if we somehow manage to pull this off, they'll court-martial both of us. We'll spend the next 10 years in military prison. Then we better not get caught." Sarah replied with a slight smile. Jake laughed despite himself. "You know what, Lieutenant? I've been flying helicopters in combat zones for over a decade, and I've never done anything truly crazy. Maybe it's about time." He began untying the helicopter's rotor blades from their security cables. "But we're going to need help. This isn't a one-person job." Within 30 minutes, Sarah and Jake had quietly assembled a small crew. Sergeant Mike Chen, the helicopter's crew chief, volunteered without hesitation when they explained the situation. "My brother's a Marine," was all he said before beginning his pre-flight preparations. Corporal Lisa Washington, a medic, insisted on coming along when she learned about the wounded Marines who needed immediate evacuation. "Somebody's got to take care of those boys," she said, loading medical supplies into the helicopter's cargo bay. Private First Class David Park, barely 20 years old, was supposed to be sleeping, but he had overheard their conversation and quietly appeared with additional ammunition and emergency rations. "I can't fly or fix people," he said, "but I can carry things and watch for bad guys." As the team made their final preparations, Sarah felt a mixture of fear and determination that she had never experienced before. She was about to violate direct orders from her commanding officer. She was about to risk the lives of 5 people to save 480 others. If anything went wrong, if anyone died because of her decision, she would have to live with that responsibility for the rest of her life. But as she thought about Staff Sergeant Rodriguez and Private Johnson and Corporal Williams, she knew she couldn't live with herself if she did nothing. Sometimes doing the right thing meant breaking the rules. Sometimes saving lives was worth risking everything. At 5:15 hours, as the first wisps of fog began to roll through the valleys around the base, Sarah climbed into the co-pilot seat of the Black Hawk. Jake was running through his final pre-flight checks, his hands moving with the practiced precision of thousands of hours of flight experience. "Ground control. This is Black Hawk 77 requesting permission for routine morning patrol," Jake said into his radio, his voice calm and professional. "Black Hawk 77, you are cleared for departure. Have a safe flight." Jake looked at Sarah as the helicopter's engines began to wind up. "Last chance to change your mind, Lieutenant. Once we lift off, there's no going back." Sarah strapped on her helmet and checked her radio equipment. Through the helicopter's windows, she could see the fog getting thicker, rolling across the landscape like a gray blanket. Somewhere in that fog, 480 Marines were fighting for their lives. "Let's go save some Marines," she said. The Black Hawk lifted off into the pre-dawn darkness, its rotors beating steadily as it disappeared into the fog. Behind them, the base continued its normal routine, unaware that 5 soldiers had just embarked on an unauthorized mission that would either save hundreds of lives or cost them everything. As they flew toward Hill 394, Sarah checked her watch. The fog would last for approximately 90 minutes. After that, they would be flying in broad daylight, completely exposed to enemy fire. But 90 minutes might be enough time to prove that sometimes the impossible was just another word for difficult. The Black Hawk flew through the fog like a ghost, its rotors barely audible above the whisper of wind through the rocky canyons. Sarah had her eyes glued to the GPS display, guiding Jake through the narrow eastern approach she had identified during the briefing. The visibility was so poor that they couldn't see more than 20 feet in any direction. But that same fog was keeping them invisible to Taliban fighters positioned around Hill 394. 2 clicks out, Sarah announced through her headset. "The canyon should be coming up on our right." Jake's hands were steady on the controls despite the treacherous flying conditions. Flying in zero visibility required complete trust in instruments and absolute faith in the person providing navigation. One wrong turn could send them crashing into a mountainside. "I see it," he said as the dark walls of the canyon became visible through the fog. "This is going to be tight." The canyon was even narrower than Sarah had remembered from her previous reconnaissance flights. The Blackhawk's rotor diameter was 53 feet, and the canyon wall seemed barely wider than that. Jake had to fly perfectly centered to avoid clipping the rocky sides. Sergeant Chen watched nervously from his position at the crew door, ready to spot any obstacles that might suddenly appear in the fog. "Contact front," Chen suddenly called out. "I've got movement on the left wall." Everyone tensed as Jake slowed the helicopter to a hover. Through the fog, they could make out shapes moving along a narrow ledge about 50 feet above them. Sarah felt her heart hammering as she raised her binoculars, trying to identify whether they were looking at Taliban fighters or mountain goats. "Goats," she said with relief. "Just mountain goats." They continued through the canyon for another 10 minutes before the walls began to widen. Sarah could see on her GPS that they were now less than half a mile from Hill 394. According to her calculations, the Marines should be positioned on the rocky outcrop directly ahead, but the fog was still too thick to see anything. "I'm going to try to raise them on the radio," Sarah said, switching to the emergency frequency that all isolated units monitored. Bravo Company, this is Lightning 6-7. If you copy, pop smoke." Static filled the airwaves for several seconds. Then a voice crackled through, weak but clear. "Lightning 6-7, this is Bravo 6. Holy shit, are you really out there? Bravo 6, we are approximately 400 meters south of your position. Pop smoke so we can find you in this fog. Smoke is out. Red smoke, red smoke." Jake banked the helicopter left, following Sarah's directions as she tried to spot the smoke signal. The fog was beginning to thin slightly as the sun climbed higher, but visibility was still extremely limited. Then Corporal Washington spotted it through her window. "Red smoke, 2 o'clock. About 200 meters," she called out. As they approached the landing zone, the scene that greeted them was worse than anyone had imagined. The Marines had been under constant attack for over 18 hours. Their defensive perimeter had shrunk to an area about the size of a football field, with wounded Marines lying behind whatever cover they could find. Equipment was scattered everywhere and the rocky ground was stained with blood. Jake brought the Blackhawk into a hover about 30 feet above the ground. The landing zone was too small and too rocky for a normal landing, so he would have to maintain a hover while the Marines climbed aboard. "This is as close as I can get," he announced. "Tell them to move fast." Sarah keyed her radio. "Bravo 6, we cannot land. You need to load your wounded first. We'll take as many as we can carry." What happened next would be burned into Sarah's memory forever. Despite being exhausted, hungry, and under enemy fire, the Marines moved with incredible efficiency. The walking wounded helped carry the more seriously injured toward the helicopter. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez, whom Sarah recognized immediately, was directing the evacuation despite having a bloody bandage wrapped around his left arm. Sergeant Chen lowered the helicopter's rescue hoist, and the Marines began loading their wounded comrades one by one. Each man who was lifted into the helicopter was a testament to the brotherhood that existed among these fighters. Nobody complained about being left behind. Nobody pushed to get on first. The most seriously wounded went first, period. Private Johnson, the 19-year-old from Ohio, was among the wounded being loaded aboard. He had taken shrapnel in his leg and couldn't walk, but he was conscious and alert. As Chen helped him into the helicopter, Johnson grabbed the crew chief's arm. "Tell my girlfriend Sarah I love her," he said, tears streaming down his face. "Tell her I tried to make it home." "You are going home," Chen replied firmly. "You're getting out of here right now." They loaded 18 wounded Marines into the Blackhawk before Jake announced that they were at maximum weight capacity. "That's all we can take this trip," he said. "Any more and we won't be able to get airborne." Sarah looked down at the Marines still on the ground. There were over 460 men still trapped, still fighting, still hoping for rescue. She keyed her radio to speak to their commander. "Bravo 6, we'll be back in 30 minutes. Keep your heads down and keep fighting." "Roger that, Lightning 6-7. We'll be here." The flight back to base was a race against time and the rising sun. The fog was beginning to lift in places, creating gaps where Taliban fighters might spot the helicopter. Jake flew low and fast, using every bit of terrain to mask their movement. In the cargo bay, Corporal Washington worked frantically to stabilize the wounded Marines, starting IVs and applying pressure bandages. When they landed at the base medical facility, a team of doctors and nurses was waiting. Word had somehow spread about the unauthorized rescue mission, and medical personnel had volunteered to stay on duty to help with casualties. Sarah watched as the wounded Marines were rushed into the field hospital, knowing that several of them might not have survived another hour without medical attention. But there was no time to rest or celebrate. Jake was already refueling the helicopter while Chen checked for any damage from their flight through the canyon. They had proven that the rescue was possible, but they had also used up precious time. The fog was lifting faster than Sarah had calculated, and their next flight would be much more dangerous. As they prepared for their second trip, Colonel Richards appeared on the flight line with 2 military police officers. Sarah's heart sank as she realized their unauthorized mission had been discovered. She climbed out of the helicopter to face the consequences of her decision. "Lieutenant Martinez," the colonel said, his voice tight with controlled anger. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" "Sir, I'm rescuing Marines," Sarah replied, standing at attention despite knowing she was about to be arrested. "You disobeyed a direct order. You stole military equipment. You risked the lives of your crew for an unauthorized mission." Colonel Richard stepped closer, his face red with fury. "I should have you court-martialed right now." Sarah looked him straight in the eye. "Yes, sir. You should. But while you're arresting me, 462 Marines are still trapped on that hill, and the fog won't last much longer." The colonel stared at her for a long moment. Behind him, the medical team was wheeling wounded Marines into the hospital. Some of these men would see their families again because Sarah had defied his orders. The mathematics of war suddenly didn't seem as simple as it had 18 hours ago. "How many trips will it take?" he asked quietly. "At least 20 more, sir. Maybe 25 if we can't take full loads due to enemy fire." Colonel Richards looked at the helicopter, then at the wounded Marines being treated by medical staff, then back at Sarah. Military protocol demanded that he arrest her immediately, but military honor demanded something else entirely. "You have 2 hours before I officially know what you're doing," he said finally. "After that, I'll have no choice but to stop this mission and place you under arrest." Sarah felt a surge of gratitude and determination. 2 hours wasn't much time, but it might be enough to save most of the trapped Marines. "Thank you, sir." As she climbed back into the helicopter for their second trip, Sarah realized that she wasn't the only one willing to risk everything to save lives. Sometimes the chain of command worked both ways. The second trip to Hill 394 was entirely different from the first. The fog had lifted enough that Jake could see terrain features, but it had also lifted enough that Taliban fighters could see them. As they approached the eastern canyon, the radio crackled with urgent warnings from the Marines on the ground. "Lightning 6-7, be advised. We have enemy movement in the canyon." "They're trying to set up an ambush." Sarah's stomach dropped. The Taliban had figured out their approach route and were moving fighters to intercept them. What had been a secret passage was now a potential death trap. But turning back meant abandoning the Marines, and that wasn't an option. "Jake, can we approach from a different direction?" she asked, studying the map on her tablet. "Not without flying directly over their main positions," Jake replied grimly. "The canyon is our only cover. We go through, or we don't go at all." Sergeant Chen checked his machine gun and made sure his ammunition was properly loaded. "If they want to fight, we'll give them one," he said with determination that surprised even himself. They entered the canyon at high speed, flying barely 10 feet above the rocky floor. The walls seemed to close in around them as Jake pushed the Blackhawk to its limits. Sarah watched for muzzle flashes or movement that would indicate enemy positions, her hand hovering over the radio to call out threats. The attack came suddenly and without warning. Machine gun fire erupted from multiple positions along the canyon walls, green tracer rounds lighting up the fog like deadly fireworks. The helicopter shuddered as bullets struck the fuselage, and Jake fought to maintain control as rounds shattered the windscreen. Taking fire from both sides, Chen yelled over the noise, returning fire with his door gun. Multiple positions, both walls of the canyon. Jake banked hard left, then right, trying to throw off the enemy's aim while maintaining their forward momentum. The helicopter's engine screamed in protest as he demanded maximum power. Bullets continued to ping off the aircraft's armor, and Sarah could smell smoke beginning to fill the cabin. "Hydraulic pressure dropping," Jake announced, his voice steady despite the chaos around them. "We're losing flight controls." The helicopter began to feel sluggish in Jake's hands, requiring more and more effort to maintain their heading. But they were almost through the canyon, almost to the relative safety of the open valley beyond. Just a few more seconds, and they would be clear. That's when Private Park was hit. The 20-year-old soldier had been watching for threats through his window when a lucky shot from below struck him in the shoulder. He cried out and fell backward, blood immediately soaking through his uniform. Corporal Washington immediately moved to help him, applying pressure to the wound while trying to keep herself low to avoid enemy fire. "Park's hit," she called out. "Shoulder wound, but he's losing blood fast." Sarah felt a wave of guilt wash over her. Park was wounded because of her decision to disobey orders. His blood was on her hands just as surely as if she had pulled the trigger herself. But there was no time for self-recrimination. They had to get to the Marines on Hill 394, complete their rescue mission, and get everyone home alive. They broke free of the canyon and into the valley beyond, but their troubles were far from over. The fog had lifted significantly, giving them much better visibility but also exposing them to enemy fire from the Taliban positions surrounding Hill 394. Sarah could see muzzle flashes from at least a dozen different locations as fighters opened up on the approaching helicopter. "This is going to be interesting," Jake muttered, beginning evasive maneuvers that threw everyone in the helicopter around like rag dolls. The approach to the landing zone was a nightmare of gunfire and explosions. Rocket-propelled grenades streaked past the helicopter, exploding against the rocky hillside in showers of debris and flame. Jake flew in a zigzag pattern, never staying on the same heading for more than a few seconds, making the helicopter as difficult a target as possible. When they reached the Marines' position, the situation had deteriorated significantly since their first visit. The defensive perimeter had shrunk even further under constant pressure from Taliban attacks. Sarah could see that several Marines had been killed or wounded in the time since their last visit, their bodies covered with ponchos behind the fighting positions. Jake brought the helicopter into another hover, this time under much more intense fire than before. Bullets were striking the aircraft constantly now, and Sarah could hear the distinctive sound of rounds penetrating the thin aluminum skin of the fuselage. They wouldn't be able to maintain this position for very long. Bravo 6 were taking heavy fire. Sarah radioed to the Marine commander. "Load as fast as you can. We can't stay here long." The Marines moved with desperate efficiency, knowing that this might be their last chance for evacuation. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez was still directing the evacuation, but Sarah could see that he was moving more slowly now, clearly exhausted from hours of continuous combat. The Marines who were being loaded onto the helicopter were a mix of walking wounded and soldiers whose ammunition had run dangerously low. Corporal Williams, the Marine with 3 children and a pregnant wife, was among those being evacuated. As Chen helped him aboard, Williams grabbed the crew chief's hand. "My wife doesn't know I'm here," he said urgently. "If something happens to me, tell her I was thinking about her and the kids at the end." "Nothing's going to happen to you," Chen replied. "You're going home to see that new baby." They managed to load 21 Marines this time, more than the helicopter was designed to carry, but Jake assured them he could handle the extra weight. As they lifted off from Hill 394, the Taliban fighters concentrated their fire on the departing aircraft, apparently recognizing that preventing the evacuation was their best chance of winning the battle. An RPG exploded so close to the helicopter that the shockwave threw it sideways. Jake fought to regain control as alarms began sounding in the cockpit, indicating damage to multiple systems. The engine temperature was climbing rapidly, and they were losing oil pressure in the transmission. "We're not going to make it back to base," Jake announced calmly. "I'm going to have to put her down somewhere short of the wire." Sarah felt her heart sink. A forced landing in Taliban territory would mean capture or death for everyone aboard, including the wounded Marines they were trying to save. But Jake was already scanning the terrain ahead, looking for the best possible landing site. "There," he said, pointing to a small cleared area about 2 miles from Hill 394. "It's not ideal, but it's our best shot." The emergency landing was controlled chaos. Jake brought the Black Hawk down hard but safely, the landing gear digging into the rocky ground as the helicopter finally came to rest. Steam was rising from the engines and Sarah could smell burning oil and electronics. "Everyone out," Jake ordered. "This bird is finished." They had 21 wounded Marines, 1 wounded crew member, and no way to continue the rescue mission. They were stranded in enemy territory with limited ammunition and no way to call for help. The unauthorized rescue mission that had started with such hope was beginning to look like a disaster. But as Sarah helped evacuate the wounded Marines from the smoking helicopter, she noticed something that gave her hope. In the distance, she could hear the distinctive sound of rotor blades approaching. Multiple helicopters, flying fast and low. Colonel Richards had decided that 2 hours was long enough to wait. 3 UH-60 Blackhawks appeared through the morning haze, flying in tight formation with their door guns trained on the surrounding terrain. Behind them came 2 Apache attack helicopters, their weapon systems already locked onto Taliban positions, that had been firing at the downed rescue helicopter. Colonel Richards's voice crackled over the radio, clear and authoritative. "Lightning 6-7, this is Thunder 6. We're coming to get you." Sarah felt a mixture of relief and apprehension as she watched the rescue force approach. She was grateful that help had arrived, but she knew that her military career was effectively over. Disobeying direct orders in a combat zone was a court-martial offense that could result in years in military prison. But as she looked at the wounded Marines around her, she knew she would make the same decision again. The Apache helicopters immediately began engaging Taliban positions with their 30mm chain guns, sending streams of high-explosive rounds into enemy fighting positions. The noise was deafening, but it was the most beautiful sound Sarah had ever heard. For the first time in hours, the Marines weren't taking incoming fire. The first Black Hawk landed in a cloud of dust and debris, and Colonel Richards himself jumped out before the helicopter had fully touched down. Sarah snapped to attention as he approached, expecting to be placed under arrest immediately. "Lieutenant Martinez," the colonel said, his voice surprisingly calm. "Report." "Sir, we successfully evacuated 39 Marines from Hill 394 before mechanical failure forced us down. We have 1 crew member wounded, and 21 additional Marines requiring medical evacuation." Sarah paused, then added, "Sir, I take full responsibility for this unauthorized mission." Colonel Richards looked at the wounded Marines being loaded onto the evacuation helicopters, then back at Sarah. "How many Marines are still trapped on that hill?" "Approximately 440, sir. They're low on ammunition and water. Without immediate evacuation, they won't last another 24 hours. The colonel nodded grimly. "Jake, can you fly?" "Chief Warrant?" Officer Thompson was leaning against the disabled helicopter, holding a blood-soaked bandage against a cut on his forehead. "Yes, sir, it's just a scratch." "Good, you're flying with me." Richards turned to Sarah. "Lieutenant, you know that terrain better than anyone. I need you to guide the rest of this evacuation." Sarah couldn't believe what she was hearing. Instead of being arrested, she was being asked to continue the mission she had started. "Sir, I thought I was under arrest for disobeying orders." "You will be," Richards replied with a slight smile, "after we finish saving those Marines." What followed was the largest helicopter evacuation operation in the history of the Afghanistan conflict. 8 Blackhawks and 4 Apache helicopters worked in continuous rotation, ferrying Marines from Hill 394 back to the safety of Forward Operating Base Kilo. Sarah coordinated the operation from the lead helicopter, using her knowledge of the EO terrain to guide pilots through the safest approach routes. The Taliban fought desperately to prevent the evacuation, but they were overwhelmed by the firepower of the Apache helicopters and the coordinated tactics of the rescue force. Every time enemy fighters tried to establish firing positions, they were immediately suppressed by 30mm cannon fire and Hellfire missiles. By noon, they had evacuated over 300 Marines. The remaining fighters on Hill 394 had consolidated into an even smaller perimeter, but they were holding their ground with renewed hope. Every successful evacuation flight proved that they weren't being abandoned, that someone was willing to risk everything to bring them home. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez was among the Marines evacuated on the 5th flight. As he was helped aboard Sarah's helicopter, he grabbed her arm and looked her directly in the eyes. "Ma'am, I don't know what possessed you to come get us, but you saved a lot of lives today," he said, his voice hoarse from shouting orders over gunfire. "A lot of mothers are going to see their sons again because of what you did." Sarah felt tears welling up in her eyes, but she forced herself to maintain her composure. "Just doing my job, Sergeant." "No, ma'am," Rodriguez replied. This was way above and beyond the job. The most challenging evacuation came during the afternoon, when they had to extract the final 50 Marines. including the command element that had been coordinating the defense. These were the fighters who had held the perimeter together for over 24 hours, who had refused evacuation so that wounded comrades could be taken first. The Taliban, sensing that their opportunity was slipping away, launched a final desperate assault on the hilltop position. Hundreds of fighters emerged from concealed positions, attacking from all sides in a last-ditch effort to overrun the Marine position before the evacuation could be completed. The Apache helicopters ran low on ammunition, forcing them to return to base for rearming while the final evacuation took place. Without their covering fire, the Blackhawks had to rely on the Marines' ground fire and their own door guns to suppress enemy attacks. Jake, flying the lead evacuation helicopter despite his head injury, brought his aircraft into the landing zone under the heaviest fire of the entire day. Tracers were crisscrossing the air like deadly fireworks, and RPGs were exploding all around the helicopter. Sarah watched the fuel gauge drop rapidly as bullets punctured the fuel tanks, and she knew they had maybe one more trip before the helicopter would be too damaged to fly. "This is it," she announced over the radio. "Everyone on the ground, this is your ride home." The final 50 Marines ran toward the helicopter through a gauntlet of enemy fire. Several were hit during the short sprint, but their comrades helped carry them aboard. The helicopter was so overloaded that it could barely lift off, but Jake somehow coaxed it into the air as bullets continued to strike the fuselage. As they cleared the hilltop and headed toward base, Sarah looked back at Hill 394 one last time. The rocky outcrop was now under complete Taliban control, with enemy fighters visible throughout the position. If they had waited even another hour, none of the Marines would have survived. The final tally was staggering. 480 Marines evacuated safely, with only 18 killed in action during the entire 24-hour battle. Without the unauthorized rescue mission that Sarah had initiated, casualty estimates suggested that fewer than 50 Marines would have survived until a conventional rescue force could have been organized. But as they approached Forward Operating Base Kilo, Sarah knew that her own story was far from over. Military police vehicles were already positioned on the landing zone, waiting to take her into custody. She had saved hundreds of lives, but she had also violated fundamental military discipline in the process. As the helicopter touched down and the engines began to wind down, Colonel Richards turned to face her. "Lieutenant Martinez, you are under arrest for disobeying direct orders, unauthorized use of military equipment, and reckless endangerment of personnel." Sarah nodded and began removing her flight gear. "I understand, sir. However," the colonel continued, "I will be recommending you for the Distinguished Service Cross for extraordinary heroism in action against an armed enemy." As the police led her away in handcuffs, Sarah could see wounded Marines being rushed into the field hospital. Private Johnson from Ohio was among them, conscious and talking to the medical staff. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez was arguing with doctors who wanted to admit him for observation. Corporal Williams was already on the phone with his pregnant wife, telling her that he was safe and would be home soon. 480 Marines would see their families again, because one lieutenant had decided that sometimes the right thing to do was the wrong thing to do. Sometimes saving lives was worth risking everything, including your own freedom. 3 months later, Lieutenant Sarah Martinez stood at attention in the Pentagon's Hall of Heroes, wearing her dress blue uniform with a chest full of ribbons and medals. The Distinguished Service Cross hung around her neck, its blue ribbon a stark contrast to the gold star that marked her as one of America's most decorated soldiers. But the ceremony felt surreal, like she was watching someone else's life unfold. The past 3 months had been a whirlwind of investigations, hearings, and media attention. The story of the unauthorized rescue mission had leaked to the press within days of the operation, and Sarah had become an overnight celebrity. News outlets called her a hero, a maverick, and a symbol of everything that was right about the American military. But the military justice system had seen things differently. The court-martial had been swift and decisive. Sarah had pled guilty to all charges: disobeying direct orders, unauthorized use of military equipment, and reckless endangerment of personnel. She had refused to mount a defense, stating simply that she had made her choice and was prepared to accept the consequences. The military judge, Colonel Patricia Hayes, had listened to testimony from dozens of witnesses. The rescued Marines had spoken eloquently about Sarah's heroism and the lives she had saved. Colonel Richards had testified about the impossible tactical situation and his reluctant decision to give Sarah unofficial authorization for the mission. Military prosecutors had argued that discipline was the foundation of military effectiveness, and that officers who disobeyed orders, regardless of their motivations, had to be held accountable. In the end, Colonel Hayes had sentenced Sarah to 6 months in military prison, reduction in rank to second lieutenant, and dismissal from the service. It was a lenient sentence considering the severity of the charges, but it effectively ended Sarah's military career. The irony was not lost on anyone present. On the same day that Sarah received the military's second highest award for valor, she was also officially dismissed from the service for the actions that had earned her that award. Secretary of Defense Margaret Thompson approached the podium to present the medal. Lieutenant Martinez, by direction of the President of the United States, the Distinguished Service Cross is awarded to you for extraordinary heroism in connection with military operations against an armed enemy. As the secretary placed the medal around her neck, Sarah thought about the Marines who weren't there to see this ceremony, the 18 who had died on Hill 394 before the evacuation could be completed. Their families had been at the funerals, not at medal ceremonies. Their sacrifice had made the rescue possible, but they would never know how many lives their courage had saved. After the ceremony, Sarah found herself surrounded by reporters asking questions about her future plans, her thoughts on military discipline, and whether she regretted her decision to disobey orders. She answered politely but briefly, eager to escape the attention and return to some semblance of normal life. But normal life proved elusive. Job offers poured in from defense contractors, private security companies, and consulting firms. Publishers wanted her to write a book about her experiences. Hollywood producers wanted to make a movie about the rescue mission. Everyone, it seemed, wanted to capitalize on her story. The person Sarah most wanted to talk to was Jake Thompson, the pilot who had risked his own career to fly the unauthorized rescue mission. Jake had also been court-martialed and dismissed from the service, but unlike Sarah, he had received no medals or recognition. The military had decided that pilots were expected to follow orders without question, and Jake's decision to participate in the unauthorized mission had been viewed more harshly than Sarah's decision to initiate it. She found Jake at a small bar near Fort Rucker, Alabama, where he was working as a civilian flight instructor. He looked older than she remembered, with gray streaks in his hair that hadn't been there 3 months ago. But his eyes still held the same quiet competence that had made her trust him with the most important mission of her life. "Well, if it isn't America's most famous military criminal," Jake said with a wry smile as Sarah approached his table. "How does it feel to be a hero and a convict at the same time?" "Confusing," Sarah admitted, sitting down across from him. "How are you doing, Jake?" "Can't complain. Teaching young pilots how to fly helicopters without getting themselves killed. It's not as exciting as combat missions, but it pays the bills." Jake took a sip of his beer. Besides, at my age, excitement is overrated. They sat in comfortable silence for a few minutes, both lost in their own thoughts. Finally, Sarah spoke up. "Do you ever regret it? What we did that day?" Jake considered the question carefully. "I regret that we had to do it. I regret that 18 Marines died before we could get them all out. I regret that good soldiers like us got thrown out of the military for doing what we thought was right." He paused. "But I don't regret saving 480 lives. I sleep better at night knowing that those Marines made it home to their families." Sarah nodded. That was exactly how she felt, but she hadn't been able to put it into words until now. "I got a letter last week," Jake continued, "from Corporal Williams's wife. Remember him? The Marine with 3 kids and a pregnant wife?" "I remember. She had her baby. A little girl. Guess what she named her?" Sarah felt tears welling up in her eyes. "Don't tell me." "Sarah Elizabeth Williams. Born on October 15th, weighing 7 pounds 2 ounces. Her father says she's going to grow up knowing about the lady who brought her daddy home." For the first time since the rescue mission, Sarah cried. Not tears of sadness or regret, but tears of overwhelming emotion that she couldn't quite categorize. Joy, grief, pride, and humility all mixed together in a way that left her speechless. Over the following months, letters and emails poured in from the rescued Marines and their families. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez had been promoted, and was training new Marines at Camp Pendleton. Private Johnson had married his girlfriend from Ohio and was studying engineering at Ohio State University on the GI Bill. Dozens of others had returned to civilian life, started families, and begun new chapters in their lives. Each letter contained the same message: "Thank you for bringing us home." Sarah eventually accepted a position with a nonprofit organization that provided support services to military families. It wasn't the career she had planned, but it felt right. She was still serving, still helping military families, just in a different capacity. 5 years after the rescue mission, Sarah received an invitation that surprised her. The Marine Corps was dedicating a new training facility at Camp Pendleton, and they wanted her to speak at the dedication ceremony. The facility would be named the Hill 394 Memorial Training Center, honoring the Marines who had died in the battle. Standing before an audience of several hundred Marines and their families, Sarah looked out at faces that represented the future of American military service. Young men and women who would face impossible decisions in dangerous places, who would have to choose between following orders and following their conscience. 5 years ago, I made a decision that ended my military career, she began. I chose to disobey direct orders to save the lives of fellow service members. I was court-martialed, dismissed from the service, and branded a military criminal. The audience listened in respectful silence. I'm not here today to tell you to disobey orders. Military discipline is essential to our effectiveness as a fighting force. But I am here to tell you that sometimes the right thing to do is not the easy thing to do. Sometimes serving your country means being willing to sacrifice everything, including your own career, for the lives of your fellow service members. Sarah paused, looking out at the young faces in the audience. The 18 Marines who died on Hill 394 taught me that courage isn't the absence of fear. It's doing what needs to be done despite that fear. The 480 Marines who survived taught me that no one gets left behind regardless of the cost. And the military justice system taught me that actions have consequences, but that doesn't make them wrong. As she concluded her speech, Sarah noticed a familiar face in the audience. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez, now wearing the chevrons of a gunnery sergeant, was standing in the back row with tears streaming down his face. Next to him stood a young woman in a Marine dress blue uniform, and Sarah realized she was looking at Private Rodriguez, the staff sergeant's daughter, who had enlisted in the Marines and was now carrying on her father's tradition of service. After the ceremony, Rodriguez approached Sarah with his daughter in tow. "Ma'am, I'd like you to meet Private Rodriguez. She's heard the story of Hill 394 about 1,000 times, and she wanted to meet the officer who saved her old man's life." The young Marine snapped to attention and saluted crisply. "It's an honor to meet you, ma'am. My father says I have you to thank for being here." Sarah returned the salute and smiled. "Your father is one of the finest Marines I've ever served with. The honor is mine." As Sarah watched the young Marine walk away with her father, she realized that the rescue mission on Hill 394 had created ripples that would continue for generations. The Marines who had survived would tell their children about the day they were saved. Those children might choose military service themselves, inspired by stories of courage and sacrifice, had made the rescue possible, but they would never know how many lives their courage had saved. After the ceremony, Sarah found herself surrounded by reporters asking questions about her future plans, her thoughts on military discipline, and whether she regretted her decision to disobey orders. She answered politely but briefly, eager to escape the attention and return to some semblance of normal life. But normal life proved elusive. Job offers poured in from defense contractors, private security companies, and consulting firms. Publishers wanted her to write a book about her experiences. Hollywood producers wanted to make a movie about the rescue mission. Everyone, it seemed, wanted to capitalize on her story. The person Sarah most wanted to talk to was Jake Thompson, the pilot who had risked his own career to fly the unauthorized rescue mission. Jake had also been court-martialed and dismissed from the service, but unlike Sarah, he had received no medals or recognition. The military had decided that pilots were expected to follow orders without question, and Jake's decision to participate in the unauthorized mission had been viewed more harshly than Sarah's decision to initiate it. She found Jake at a small bar near Fort Rucker, Alabama, where he was working as a civilian flight instructor. He looked older than she remembered, with gray streaks in his hair that hadn't been there 3 months ago, but his eyes still held the same quiet competence that had made her trust him with the most important mission of her life. Well, if it isn't America's most famous military criminal, Jake said with a wry smile as Sarah approached his table. How does it feel to be a hero and a convict at the same time? Confusing, Sarah admitted, sitting down across from him. How are you doing, Jake? Can't complain. Teaching young pilots how to fly helicopters without getting themselves killed. It's not as exciting as combat missions, but it pays the bills. Jake took a sip of his beer. Besides, at my age, excitement is overrated. They sat in comfortable silence for a few minutes, both lost in their own thoughts. Finally, Sarah spoke up. Do you ever regret it? What we did that day? Jake considered the question carefully. I regret that we had to do it. I regret that 18 Marines died before we could get them all out. I regret that good soldiers like us got thrown out of the military for doing what we thought was right. He paused. But I don't regret saving 480 lives. I sleep better at night knowing that those Marines made it home to their families. Sarah nodded. That was exactly how she felt, but she hadn't been able to put it into words until now. I got a letter last week, Jake continued. From Corporal Williams' wife. Remember him? The Marine with 3 kids and a pregnant wife? I remember. She had her baby. A little girl. Guess what she named her? Sarah felt tears welling up in her eyes. Don't tell me. Sarah Elizabeth Williams. Born on October 15th, weighing 7 pounds 2 ounces. Her father says she's going to grow up knowing about the lady who brought her daddy home. For the first time since the rescue mission, Sarah cried. Not tears of sadness or regret, but tears of overwhelming emotion that she couldn't quite categorize. Joy, grief, pride, and humility all mixed together in a way that left her speechless. Over the following months, letters and emails poured in from the rescued Marines and their families. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez had been promoted and was training new Marines at Camp Pendleton. Private Johnson had married his girlfriend from Ohio and was studying engineering at Ohio State University on the GI Bill. Dozens of others had returned to civilian life, started families, and begun new chapters in their lives. Each letter contained the same message. Thank you for bringing us home. Sarah eventually accepted a position with a nonprofit organization that provided support services to military families. It wasn't the career she had planned, but it felt right. She was still serving, still helping military families, just in a different capacity. 5 years after the rescue mission, Sarah received an invitation that surprised her. The Marine Corps was dedicating a new training facility at Camp Pendleton, and they wanted her to speak at the dedication ceremony. The facility would be named the Hill 394 Memorial Training Center, honoring the Marines who had died in the battle. Standing before an audience of several hundred Marines and their families, Sarah looked out at faces that represented the future of American military service. Young men and women who would face impossible decisions in dangerous places, who would have to choose between following orders and following their conscience. 5 years ago, I made a decision that ended my military career, she began. I chose to disobey direct orders to save the lives of fellow service members. I was court-martialed, dismissed from the service, and branded a military criminal. The audience listened in respectful silence. I'm not here today to tell you to disobey orders. Military discipline is essential to our effectiveness as a fighting force. But I am here to tell you that sometimes the right thing to do is not the easy thing to do. Sometimes serving your country means being willing to sacrifice everything, including your own career, for the lives of your fellow service members. Sarah paused, looking out at the young faces in the audience. The 18 Marines who died on Hill 394 taught me that courage isn't the absence of fear. It's doing what needs to be done despite that fear. The 480 Marines who survived taught me that no one gets left behind, regardless of the cost. And the military justice system taught me that actions have consequences, but that doesn't make them wrong. As she concluded her speech, Sarah noticed a familiar face in the audience. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez, now wearing the chevrons of a gunnery sergeant, was standing in the back row with tears streaming down his face. Next to him stood a young woman in a Marine dress blue uniform, and Sarah realized she was looking at Private Rodriguez, the staff sergeant's daughter, who had enlisted in the Marines and was now carrying on her father's tradition of service. After the ceremony, Rodriguez approached Sarah with his daughter in tow. Ma'am, I'd like you to meet Private Rodriguez. She's heard the story of Hill 394 about 1,000 times, and she wanted to meet the officer who saved her old man's life. The young Marine snapped to attention and saluted crisply. It's an honor to meet you, ma'am. My father says I have you to thank for being here. Sarah returned the salute and smiled. Your father is one of the finest Marines I've ever served with. The honor is mine." As Sarah watched the young Marine walk away with her father, she realized that the rescue mission on Hill 394 had created ripples that would continue for generations. The Marines who had survived would tell their children about the day they were saved. Those children might choose military service themselves, inspired by stories of courage and sacrifice. Private Sarah Elizabeth Williams would grow up knowing that she owed her existence to a lieutenant who had chosen to risk everything to bring her father home. Somewhere in Ohio, Private Johnson was probably telling his own children about the fog-covered morning when salvation arrived in the form of an unauthorized helicopter. The true measure of Sarah's sacrifice wasn't the medal around her neck or the recognition she had received. It was the lives that continued to unfold because 480 Marines had made it home from Hill 394. It was the families that remained intact, the children who grew up with fathers, the wives who didn't become widows. Sarah Martinez had defied orders and saved 480 Marines. She had sacrificed her military career and accepted the consequences of her actions. But in the end, she had learned that some things are more important than careers, more valuable than recognition, and more lasting than medals. Sometimes the greatest honor is knowing that when the moment came to choose between what was safe and what was right, you chose what was right. Sometimes leaving them speechless is the highest compliment a soldier can receive.